Okay, we're getting official here. Let's see, what have we got? The meeting notes are in the Slack or the chat. Thanks, Thomas, for doing that. Move this down. Okay, let's get started. So, share screen. Okay, sorry about this. iOS or macOS has my permissions all changed after an update that I did recently. So please bear with me here for 1 second, and I will get everything shared appropriately.
That's why you never upgrade anything.
Never. Well, I made the jump like 2 versions. I think I went from Mojave all the way to Big Sur, and
those are always hard.
Yeah,
For 20 something years, 30, they're just always hard.
okay, and of course I have to restart Zoom for some reason. So sorry everybody for this. Thomas, I'm gonna make sure that you're the host. You should be able to maintain the Slack, and then I will rejoin. Sorry everybody.
Hopefully we always keep Linkerd upgrades easier than macOS upgrades.
Okay, we're back. Now share the screen. It's like it never happened. Perfect. Where did my slides go? Boy, sorry about this. And of course, this is the day that I decided that I was going to drink a double espresso. And now I'm super jittery trying to type everything over here. Okay. Almost there. Okay. Apologies, everybody. I think we are finally good. Let's share screen. Oh, there we go. I think I got it. Do we see slides? Yes, nailed it. Super easy. First try. First try. Okay. Well, welcome everybody to the December online community meetup. Some of you may have noticed that we went straight from October to December, just like I went from Mojave to Big Sur. This is just because of the holidays. And so the next meetup we will have in January. I'm not sure if it's going to be early or late January, but we'll try and get back to that regular schedule of the last Wednesday of every month. So that being said, I hope that all of you have been enjoying your holidays. Today, our agenda is we're going to talk about Linkerd 2.9.1 and 2.10. That'll be Thomas and Oliver giving us some updates. And then our guest, Matt Young from EverQuote, will talk about Linkerd observability in the real world. And then Alex is going to give us some great detail about the new changes that are coming in the Linkerd Viz, which affects the control plane and some of the changes. He'll have more detail on that. And then we'll talk about our Linkerd heroes. Thank you all of you who took the time to vote. And Catherine has all of the details. I haven't seen the actual voting results yet, but I'm very excited. And I can assure you there has been no voter fraud. All the votes have been properly recounted and tallied, and everything is on the up and up. And finally, we'll do a Q&A with the Stump the Maintainer, which is always a fun section. So with that, let's get started. Thomas and Oliver. Oh, sorry, I have one slide to talk about our Linkerd community anchors. So this is a program that we've started a couple, I guess, 2 months ago about, and what this is it's an opportunity for you to tell your story using Linkerd in your applications in your environment.
I didn't mind the Disney stuff, to be honest, but I know a lot of people don't.
I will mute you. There we go. So we will. So as a Linkerd community anchor, you may have been on the community call where we had Nassim on, and he told us he had written a blog post that showed that he was using Linkerd in production in their environment. And so what this is an opportunity to tell your story of using Linkerd. Will help you with the the writing your talks, submitting them to conferences, and just overall working with you to tell your story, and then you become part of our Linkerd community anchor program. And so there's a link there down at the bottom of the page. If you want to learn more, please take a look at that. A good example of what we're doing with some of our current anchors is helping them with their abstracts to submit to KubeCon EU, which is taking place early next year. And so if you're interested in doing that, the window for that is closing shortly. So please do reach out through that link, and we can help you submit those before the due date closes. Before the CFP closes. So with that, now we're ready to go into the updates. Go back to the agenda. There we go. So I'll hand it over to Thomas and Oliver.
Hey, Thomas.
Yes. I was actually going to say, so Oliver, tell me where 291 is.
Well, I am muted first. Anyway, so 291 is getting really close. I think we'll hopefully get it today, maybe tomorrow. We're just trying to fix a couple upgrade and install issues that we spotted over the last week or two. 291 primarily tries to address some issues around staleness that we spotted with 290, specifically with headless services. And so if you talk to a pod directly that doesn't exist, we'll continue trying to talk to that, and we'll never fail your client. And 291 fixes that issue to make sure we propagate those failures back to the client. So that's and aside from that, I think there's a few kind of CLI and control plane, just minor polish things that we're getting in. So that'll be good. 210 is the work we've been spending most of our time on. So 291, we're just doing cherry picks back on the 29 branch without the kind of bigger changes. 210 has a lot of big changes, especially to the install flow. Alex will talk a little bit more about that later. But the big tentpole items in 210 are one, to separate all the dashboard, Viz, Grafana, Prometheus, Jaeger stuff into kind of a separate Linkerd extension. This also promote things like multi-cluster into its own Linkerd extension. So that the real goal of that is that the core Linkerd install, the things that you actually need for routing traffic and keeping things up, the identity service, the destination controller, and the proxy injector, those things can be kind of installed in a micro control plane to lessen the footprint of Linkerd, and then make all of the other optional Viz things that you don't need to get up and running necessarily as a separate component. The other work we're doing in 210 is focused around extending TCP Mtls. So in 290, we started doing MTLS on arbitrary TCP traffic. The caveats there are for server first protocols where you have to skip the proxy. We can't do MTLS in those yet. And we can't do TCP for multi-cluster. And so the 210 work we're doing on the proxy and multi-cluster gateway side is to enable MTLS and TCP to transport in every possible environment. And that really opens the door for things like policy. So we haven't really wanted to bite off authorization policies or anything like that until we really have the fundamentals of all of the traffic being able to be discussed in terms of this policy, so we're not hitting blind spots. And so once that work is underway, we'll start getting into, or once that work is a little bit further down the line, we'll start getting into the design for authorization policies and potentially deprecating the service profile API and moving that forward into a kind of more Kubernetes native thing to address some of the issues we spotted there. So all of that work is in flight. I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll be getting our Cs out in early January, but you know, software development is more art than science, so we'll see.
I know a lot of folks who are super excited about the TCP multi-cluster and the server speaks first work. When do you think that'll be landing in an edge nearest for folks to kick the tires and play around?
Yeah, the server speaks first work without multi-cluster and without MTLS is just landing hopefully in this week's edge. The proxy already supports the discovery things it needs to basically allow that traffic through the proxy so we get metrics on it at least. And the control plane work is in a PR that should be landing any day now. It's been, I think, basically approved for the last week, but we've been doing some testing there. The proxy work I'm hoping will land probably in a week or two, but we'll see. We have a draft PR up that does the first part of that. There's some issues we spotted while testing, so we'll keep revving that. But I think in the next couple edges, we'll start to see the core parts of that land, and then the multi-cluster part of it will probably land last.
Awesome. So for most folks interested, check it out early next year, and you'll probably be surprised and amazed by where it's gotten to. Cool. I think something else to point out is that our 2.8 to 2.9 release cycle was a little long. We really bit off quite a bit between summer code and community bridge, and a lot of the work that we did there, it ended up being maybe a little bit longer than all of us would have liked. And we're kind of seeing that with 2.9.1 being a little bumpy. And so to Oliver's point, the 2.10 release is much smaller. So you're really seeing like 2 candies here, not 10 like we had in the 2.9 release, so that we get it out faster and a little bit more stable.
And actually, a lot of the work we did between 2.8 and 2.9 is setting up for the 2.10 stuff. So like I said, all the proxy discovery changes that we need for server speaks first, we had initially planned that to be in 2.9. And so we did a lot of the core work for that, even though the end-to-end feature didn't land in time for 2.9.
Awesome.
Cool.
Yeah, that's being able to see the team working on things, the code, and all the commits that are going through, and hearing some of the conversations. It's really, really helpful to understand how the releases are going. And I think Alex's conversation today about some of the control plane breakout that's happening will help give the broader community some perspective on it as well. So yeah, thanks for that. Those are great updates. So with that, I think we're ready to move into our conversation with Matt Young of EverQuote. Matt has been part of the community for longer than I've been around, for sure. So at least 1.5 years, and he has always brought great insight into he asks insightful questions about how Linkerd works. And so when we first started talking, Matt was sharing some of the integrations that he's done. And so today, Matt, I'd like to talk with you about how you use Linkerd, or how you're using Linkerd. But first, I want to take a step back, because you are the chair of SIG Observability, which is part of one of the SIGs in Kubernetes world. Can you tell us all how you got there and why observability matters to you?
Sure. Here's a link in the chat for those who might not be familiar. So, for, gosh, a long time, so 1999, 2000 or something, when I kind of first started in software. The first 5 or 6 years of my career were spent working on a kernel debugger for Windows CE. So I was like testing stack unwinders, and I wrote a profiler to surface performance metrics from ARM at the time, the PXA 250 and 255 or Xscale. And it looked at things like TLB and memory usage, and you know, it was a Monte Carlo style profiler. And from the very beginning, I was always really fascinated with debugging and helping figure out, you know, why things didn't work. And that was always like the most interesting part of software, is like some complicated thing is broken and we don't know why. And I almost found that more fun than writing new potentially broken things. So from there on, I kind of, I don't know, ever since then, in all of the various roles I've had, which have dev, test, support, research across a bunch of different enterprise software platforms and languages, somehow I'm always the person that can help deal with. Somehow I'm always a person that can help deal with when the build server goes down, or when something is hitting a wall and face planting because of load or scale or performance. So I've always kind of been a nerd for it, I guess. Zooming up to like this year, earlier this year, I kind of feel like I was lucky. There was a confluence of factors that led to the formation of SIG observability, at least for my involvement in it. I mean, at a high level, you know, many new companies getting into Kubernetes spend, or just cloud native, the whole ecosystem spend as much or more on observability than they do on, say, compute or storage. That's not uncommon, particularly if you're leveraging a bunch of vendors. Within EverQuote, which I joined just over 2 years ago, they had just begun moving services into Google's Kubernetes engine from a largely you know, EC2 virtual machine monolith style applications architecture. And so you know, the whole problem of time series, you know, having one big long time series from a virtual machine that is now exploded into a whole bunch of replicas, and needing to be able to reason on and aggregate across, you know, across all of these small, tiny time series that needed to be stitched together. Like, that was a problem to solve, particularly as we had decided to build out a new, shortly after joining, we decided to build out a new environment in AWS on EKS. And if you've ever run, we're running in both clouds now, and if you've ever run both GKE or Google's Kubernetes and EKS or Amazon's Kubernetes, there's a sizable gap. Google gives you Stackdriver, which is like a full stack observability stuff. And in EKS, you get to do it yourself or use CloudWatch. And not to disparage CloudWatch, but you know, it's quite a different UX. So we needed to build out a whole, you know, observability stack that was comparable or better to support the growth of our services. And at the same time, you know, the open source alternatives had been exploding, right? So, you know, we're running in production now Cortex and Loki. We're in the middle of deploying Tempo for distributed tracing, and we run Linkerd everywhere now. But in terms of the formation of the SIG, like my day job had this need to do this. I was kind of a geek or a nerd for it anyway, and it was kind of my first love. And then at the same time, there are all these options in open source. And if you go look at the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, or cncf.io, you look at the landscape, there's just like a huge explosion of things. There were SIGs for things like storage and networking and security. There was not one for observability. So I drafted a charter for it. I had not done this before. I had not really contributed to the CNCF in any way, but the charter's on that link I sent. And I just kind of wrote the charter and drafted the initial charter. And then we had a series for over a month and a half or 2 months of charter reviews, and just had an open invite to anyone interested. And we kind of came to a consensus on what the scope of this should be. In the last 6 months since we started in earnest, it's really seen a lot of, we've now got like a nucleus of about you know, somewhere between 12 and 20 people that show up fairly regularly from all manner of companies. And I won't bore you by going through the whole charter, but you know, it's basically there to focus on topics pertaining to the observation and understanding of cloud native workloads. So it kind of was like a 3-tuple, right? it was like something I love anyway, and something I had to do for my day job, and a big gap, I thought, in the CNCF. So I'm one of 2 chairs. We technically could have a third, but we have 2 chairs now. Richard Hartman from Grafana Labs is the other chair, and we have a tech lead, Bartek, who is involved with Thanos. And then I'll say briefly, over the summer, we have a number of work packages and work streams going on, and that is beginning to pick up speed, and we found our footing. Over the summer, we made recommendations. Sorry, I should back up. One of the functions of a special interest group, or a SIG, is to provide recommendations and guidance to the Technical Oversight Committee of the CNCF, or the TOC, on gaps or opportunities within the ecosystem, in this case, as it pertains to observability and related tooling. So one of the things that the SIG can do is due diligence reports or assessments when a project wants to move from sandbox to incubation, or from incubation to graduation. So over the summer, we did that for the Cortex project, as well as the Thanos project. And just yesterday, we wrapped up our due diligence of Open Metrics, which, if you're not familiar, is the wire protocol format, based largely on Prometheus, with a few additions like exemplars and a few other things. So it's a little long-winded maybe, but that's kind of how it came to be, and we've just been figuring it out as we go. I encourage anyone to join. We have bi-weekly meetings, and so far it's pretty cool. And I'm excited for 2021.
I will throw my hat in there. Make sure you go check the meetings out. They're always, every time I've come, they've been very, very insightful as to what's going on in the space and where I should be looking.
Yeah. In particular, most of the involvement thus far, I'm a bit of an odd duck, because I'm from the CNCF end user community via EverQuote. Many of the people there to date have been vendors, right? Like people in the space that want to engage and work on interoperability and standards, so that there's not, a cacophony of different protocols and standards. But there's a huge, one of our big gaps is we need to have people who aren't necessarily, from Datadog or Splunk or whatever, showing up, so that I'm not the only end user. But it really is meant to be a vendor neutral forum where users and vendors can all come together, and we need those requirements and scenarios and input from people actually using these things, not just creating them. So
that's great. Yeah,
Chris had a great question in the chat. What's an easy way to get involved? I dropped a link into the meetings, but is there anything else there?
Yeah, I mean, we've just started using GitHub issues. So there's a Kanban board and GitHub issues to do stuff. So if there's something you want to do, if there's something you've been working on, you can just show up and say, hi, we're a friendly bunch. You can put yourself on the agenda. It's completely open. There's no ID requirements to ensure that you are you, or anything like that. And if you're, we've got a bunch of work and over the next couple of weeks and month, from now till the end of the year, I'm going to do my steady best to take some of the ideas that we've talked about that would be cool. For example, a smart proxy for remote write, if I could throw my own in there, right? We'll get to it maybe later when we talk about how we're running things, but in a typical cluster, we've got a pair, I'll just say now, we've got a pair, as a concrete example, we've got a pair of Prometheus running in every cluster, and we have a dozen clusters. And then we have a dev and a staging and a prod environment. So every cluster is writing 4 streams of metrics just from the core, Prometheus. So, multiply that out, and suddenly there's just all this traffic happening that really could be done better with a smart proxy. So think PG Bouncer is to Postgres, as MySQL is to, as a proxy SQL is to MySQL, blank is to remote write, which is how Prometheus can forward metrics onto something like either Cortex or one of the many other things that support that protocol. Another quick concrete example is, there's a project that some folks are doing around backfilling Prometheus data and/or using Arrow to migrate big blocks of observability data, whatever that may be. So, if there's something you're passionate about, come talk about it. If there's something you want to do, cool. If there's gaps you see, or or if you're a CNCF project, or if you know someone associated with a CNCF project that might have concerns around observability. An example would be Litmus, right? They're a chaos testing thing for Kubernetes that orchestrates and runs tests and collects all the results. They expose Prometheus metrics, and they might have questions. I'm not speaking for that project, but we're reaching out to other projects to say, hey, how do you tell a developer, how do you communicate the summary of all this very complicated random testing you did and what worked and didn't? So there's a white paper being written about best practices for instrumenting applications. We're hoping to attract like UX and developer experience folks that might want to contribute there. So there's really it's new, it's nascent. We've had a lot of good. I'm excited about it, but yeah, the more the merrier. Come check us out.
I really love that. Figuring out how to communicate testing to the greater community has always been a challenge of mine.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say that, and I'm kind of nerding out here, I don't know if we're spending too much time on this topic or not, Charles, but many of the things we've talked about for years, I worked on, I spent some time at Microsoft on the System Center Virtual Machine Manager team, or on embedded devices on the CE team. And at VMware, I worked on a hybrid cloud management thing, right? So in all of these cases, there were all these scenarios that were super cool, but we couldn't do because there just wasn't enough compute, or there just wasn't enough network bandwidth, or there wasn't enough threads on your typical server to do some of these things. And many of them were like observability related, right? So we'd do sampling, we do Monte Carlo stuff. We do all this engineering to try to get around the fact that we just couldn't do everything we needed to do when we wanted to diagnose a complicated system. And the explosion of distributed systems and then monoliths turning to microservices and all of it has only like amplified that by orders of magnitude, right? But now we can do some of these things. Now we do have, servers with hundreds of threads. And so for me, it's like, I feel like I'm living in the Jetsons, because all the crap we talked about 20 years ago, we can do now, right? It's just a matter of doing it. And in the open source community, we have all this best of breed tooling that many vendors are actually using under the covers. So I feel like it's a cool time to be alive if you care about observability.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the things that you and I have talked about in the past. Is just all these different pieces that we can cobble together. And so I think one of our initial conversations, and I definitely appreciate your insights on SIG observability, and I hope that this encourages a few more folks to join. One of the questions I wanted to ask you was just when you were looking at issues that you wanted to diagnose inside of the EverQuote application or the distributed system that you're running there, what was it that drew you to Linkerd to be your service mesh of choice?
Sure. So it was right around when I joined, actually, back in 2018, and then the very beginning of 2019. So EverQuote has, we're running now dozens of systems and services. We have a huge amount of legacy systems as well that were put in place years ago that quietly do what they're meant to do. And the culture of EverQuote is very data space based, right? So data is our superpower. And so we've got hundreds of databases and various services, and there's a lot of I'm not an expert with fintech or ad engineering and things like that, but we've got a lot of data and a lot of things happening, combined with a very entrepreneurial development culture. So the small team I'm on of 5 or 6 people is supporting. Now we've grown dramatically this year and last, but we're approaching 200 engineers split into a bunch of teams, and they all run fast in parallel. And so many of them over the past couple of years, we're turning monoliths into microservices, and new services are being spun up, and predominantly they're moving to serverless Lambda architectures, or in most cases, Kubernetes. And at the same time, many of those services started using gRPC. So this should sound very familiar, right? And then that was combined with a rapid growth of the company that it's the good kind of problem to have. But, we knew we were doing gRPC, we knew we would have to load balance it, but, you can make pods really big, right? Before you actually really, really need to load balance. But we had that problem a little earlier than we expected. And so initially Istio was looked at. We in fact didn't deploy all of Istio because you know, the per pod overhead of Envoy was a little bit scary to contemplate, and the complexity of it was terrible. So, you know, we had the problem of, you know, we're running a bunch of replicas and all the traffic goes to one because H2 pools connections, and there's a whole talk there. But initially we put in place Istio, but just the ingress gateway and the bits of the control plane that allow for load balancing, but we weren't doing the full Istio. It was sort of a Franken Istio, if you will. And at the same time, you know, even though Google was pushing Istio and it was this hot new thing, it was technically in beta. So even as an enterprise customer, if we had a problem with it, too bad. They could upgrade the control plane because they have their own, they could upgrade the masters, rather, the control plane of Kubernetes itself, which would potentially break our Franken Istio in weird ways. So we were, you know, we were not having a lot of luck, and my small team knew, you know, we knew we couldn't grapple with all of it. I went to Google Next. I went to a bunch of talks as folks on my team. You know, we tried to get best of breed, and best of breed was still like, you know, talks for like, here's how you can figure out when this happens. You go to this thing and look at that log. Maybe it'll be there. And that might mean go look at this log over there. Like it was nascent. And so I don't want to slam Istio. Istio was great. But for our scenario, it was just too much. We just needed to load balance. And we also, though, you know, we knew that as we're an insurance marketplace and much of the data we handle is PII, or personally identifiable information, or now that we've stood up verticals and now we're also in, you know, we're a marketplace that is inclusive of life insurance and health insurance and things like that. Now you've got EPHI, or medically protected data. At the same time, EverQuote grew to be over the threshold where things like Sarbanes-Oxley, if you're familiar with it, you know, we have to have more rigid controls. So we needed mutual authentication in transit everywhere. And then, as I said before, you know, we had the observability stuff. So we looked at Linkerd when we realized that what Istio provided was awesome, but, you know, I didn't have 10 people to run it. So we tried Linkerd, and, you know, I could get it working on my laptop in a couple of minutes. And then we tried it on a cluster and it worked. We put it on a namespace only, and, you know, the cluster was running, but only things in this namespace would work with Linkerd, and that was all positive. And in the new environments we've built now, it runs everywhere at cluster level, except for, you know, kube system and a couple other places that don't make sense. But yeah.
Awesome. And here we are today, which is fantastic. And so, like I said, we've been in communication over the last 18 months, and it's just been, I'm so appreciative of you for being a member of the community, for helping out with folks. And I know that you are working on your integration with Cortex, and even as recently as just a couple of days ago, you've been working with some of our folks at Buoyant who are also looking to integrate with Cortex. So anybody who's in the community, I encourage you to reach out to Matt if you have questions, because he's got, as you can see, just breadth of knowledge, and he's so good at talking about the technology that he's using, and just a ton of experience with integrating different open source pieces of software like Linkerd with other projects as well. So I want to move on to Alex, but any other words, anything else you want to say to folks while you've got their attention, Matt?
Yeah, sure. I can be a little verbose, so I'll try to be brief. On the Cortex integration stuff, yes. So now that we're running Cortex, one of the reasons we chose it was it's multi-tenant and horizontally scalable. We are a small team, right? And so we're very cautious. So for example, we like the fact that Prometheus, there's a separate copy of Prometheus running in the control plane. In all of our clusters, we use the Prometheus operator, which allows self-service mechanisms, which for a small team are needed, right? But that means that some app could put a service monitor in that's a cardinality bomb that blows everything up, right? So we like that there's a separate Prometheus. We started using it, gosh, a year ago. As soon as the Helm chart came out, we started using it. We actually template out Helm charts and then use Customize to top them. So we jacked up the resources to that Prometheus so that, and I recommend you do that as well, so that if your central store goes down, you've got some buffer, if you will, in the write ahead logs. But we're going to start pointing the remote write remote writing Cortex metrics, Linkerd metrics, which are per endpoint. And as we do some more service profiles, we've just started using those for both our open API services as well as our gRPC services that use Proto. The cardinality of that's going to be huge. We think we're not sure yet, but back in the napkin says we should, put that to its own tenant. So that's one of the things we're enabling, and we're excited about it. But when we do that, now we need dashboards that are multi-cluster aware. So one of the things we've been working on the Grafana side, and how we manage all of these things, are using Grafana mixins. And for those not familiar, a mixin is a 3-tuple dashboard, recording rules and alerting rules. And so ideally, we'd like to make a mixin for Linkerd so that when you're running, a dozen clusters and all this stuff into a centralized store, you can have dashboards that are multi-cluster aware. And in fact, since they're based on JSONet, which is a really elegant language, you can put in conditional logic that says, like, if it's multi-cluster, do this, and if it's not, do that, right? And so you can really factor that. So that's one thing we'd like to do. Another thing I'll just say, if anyone hasn't yet put authentication in front of the Linkerd dashboard, all of our clusters now use OAuth 2 proxy, and we use Okta. Before that, we use G Suite, but this lets us get from the public internet in a secure way to clusters should anything happen to our VPNs. So, like, rather than having to like port forward in to do things, we wanted to make sure that in the event of a serious incident, like a network partition or something just goes horribly wrong at the VPC or networking level, we could always get in through public ingress if we needed to. So we implemented, we use Nginx for ingress, and that's all worked out very well. The last thing we're exploring as we bring online Tempo. For those not familiar with Tempo, it's the same backend architecture as Cortex and Loki, so horizontally scalable, and all of the learnings from running those translate quite nicely. And it's a distributed trace backend, with the big difference that it doesn't have a big index like Jaeger has. So you don't have a huge Cassandra thing to deal with, but you have to know the trace ID you want. So it's like a very fast key value store where the key is a trace ID and the value is a aggregated completed span. That means to find those trace IDs, we're using Loki, either logs or you could use Elasticsearch, however. So I'm kind of experimenting with the Linkerd proxy, because if I'm going to dozens of teams saying, hey, everybody needs to import trace libraries so that context propagates, but you also need to log the trace ID, that's weirdly a heavier lift, right? Like, it's one thing to say, just import this thing and you're done, and we could write a library to do it, but it's another thing to say, hey, maybe we can do this where that's all you have to do. And then the trace IDs are always logged by the Linkerd proxy, and they might already be, but if that could be done in a consistent way, cluster wide, that opens the door to just a really easy integration where we don't have to deal with header tail based sampling. We throw everything to Tempo because it can handle it, like all the trace headers all the time forever. And we'll have to benchmark it, but we think for our scale at least it'll work pretty well. And then that would be a nice tie-in. And then part and parcel with all of that, if you haven't looked at exemplars, it sounds like I don't have time to go into them, but I think that the metrics coming from Linkerd are exactly the metrics that we need to build exemplars, which are like representative examples of good or bad things, right? And so as Prometheus adopts open metrics, and as we've finished the open metrics bit, which includes this notion of an exemplar, Linkerd's control plane and/or Prometheus instance might be a great place to automatically define those exemplars, and that would make rolling SLOs across all teams or clusters for us much easier. So,
gotcha. Well, I think
this holiday season.
Oh, well, that's a lot of work in a holiday season, and I think I heard 2 or 3 contributions that we can expect from you in the next few months. So very excited, and I hope that other folks in the community jump in and collaborate with you on that as well. So really appreciate you sharing all of your. What's that?
I said my team is really small, 5 people. So I'd love to collaborate on this. Absolutely, not merely because I'm lazy, but there's a lot there. So
yeah, awesome. Okay, Matt, I really appreciate your time and sharing all of your massive amount of knowledge with us. There's a lot to unpack there. And so again, I encourage anybody in the community to reach out to Matt, either on Slack or on Twitter, and ask him questions. he and I have had some great conversations, and I think anybody else will as well. So thanks again, Matt. Yep, with that, we'll move on to Alex Leong, one of the maintainers of Linkerd. He's going to tell us about what is happening in the Linkerd control plane with regard to the Linkerd visibility or Linkerd viz component.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the work we're doing for 2.10, which involves kind of splitting out some of the components from the control plane into more modular pieces. So Oliver kind of alluded to this a little bit already, but one of the things we want to do is we want to take all of the viz components that are in the Linkerd control plane, like Prometheus and like the dashboard, and the things that power the stat command and stuff like that, and kind of make that a little more modular so it can be installed, so you can install the control plane with or without it. And so I think this is really accomplishes a few interesting things. I think it does a lot of good things architecturally for Linkerd. It makes things more modular and easier to manage, and the relationships between the components are a little more obvious. But it also lets people kind of pick and choose the components they want. So if you want a very lightweight control plane with no Prometheus, for example, which is potentially very resource intense, you can do that, and you get MTLS and discovery and all that good stuff, but without the viz side of it, if that's not something you're interested in. I think the other interesting thing this does is it lets people potentially swap out these components and replace them. So if you have a different viz stack, or if you could have a different distributed tracing stack, or something like that, it would be possible to swap that in and replace what comes, bundled with Linkerd. So the components that we're thinking about right now is that we have already completed most of the work to split all of the distributed tracing stuff into its own extension. So there's now a Linkerd Jaeger extension that you can kind of install separately from the control plane, and that layers on distributed tracing. We're in the process of doing the same thing for multi-cluster. So the multi-cluster, when you're installing the multi-cluster extension, it behaves the same way. And there's kind of a structured way for adding and removing these extensions. And then we've just started doing the same thing for the viz components. So Prometheus and the dashboard and all the things that power the visibility side of Linkerd get the same treatment. And so you can kind of pick and choose your components. Yeah.
So, clearly for something like tracing, the proxy has to be configured to know how to deal with the tracing system. So how do we, if we're taking that out of the core control plane, how does that, how do we do that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the way this kind of worked originally is we had this proxy injector, which injects the proxy, and it also injects all the configuration for the proxy, right? So you've got this control plane component that adds these sidecars and it adds all the configuration to them. And that's a mutating admission controller. So whenever a new pod is created, there's an event that goes out to this controller and it says, hey, I'd like to add this proxy container into that pod. The way we're thinking about splitting that up, or the way that we've split that up already, is that now each extension that wants to add some kind of configuration to the proxy will have its own mutating admission controller. And then so they kind of get layered on like this. So there's the main one in the control plane that adds the proxy. And then after that, these other mutating webhooks in other extensions will get invoked, and they can, further mutate that proxy by adding configuration to it. And so there's this kind of chain of webhooks that gets invoked to first add the proxy and then add whatever configuration the extensions need to add to it. Yeah, so we're really
it's a newer Kubernetes feature, right?
It's a newer-ish. I can't remember the version it was invoke or it was added, but this is this kind of re-invocation policy is seems like a pretty Kubernetes native way of doing things. It's supported through the Kubernetes API, and that's what we were kind of looking for when we designed this, is that we wanted something that played well with Kubernetes and did things in the Kubernetes way, and re-invoking webhooks through this re-invocation policy to chain them together seemed to fit that requirement.
Awesome. So, and this is slated for the 2.10 release?
Yeah, that's right. So hopefully early next year. And the work is, is well underway. Like I said, we have the Jaeger stuff already split out, and the multi-cluster and the Viz stuff is in progress. And the other thing that I'll say is that this is work that, is pretty accessible, and we'd really like to get the community involved as much as possible. So if you're at all interested in this work, we would love to, have you participate. We send out design documents to the Linkerd dev mailing list. So if you're just kind of curious what's going on, or you want to be involved in the design process, just make sure that you're subscribed to that mailing list. And that's kind of where the initial discussion happens, and the documents get shared. And then there's a design review meeting that happens after that. If you're more interested in kind of the implementation side, there is a issue dashboard, or a project, a GitHub project on the Linkerd GitHub, and you can take a look at the issues there. You can, many of them are really easy to just pick up and get started on. So if you'd like to help out, we would love to have you take a look at that board, or hop into the contributors channel in Slack, and that would be awesome.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. I will add the link to the CNCF, the discussion on the CNCF mailing list, to the meeting notes. I think that the visibility components are something that is used by so many people that it would really be helpful to get at least design input, but also contributions on that as well. So thanks for sharing that with us, Alex. I appreciate all your hard work, and I'm excited to see how it shapes up and what the result of the lighter weight control plane, the more modular approach, is going to look like.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, with that, any other notes, Alex? Is that where that's the latest update for the Linkerd Viz work?
Yeah, I think that sums it about up.
Okay, great. All right then. Well, we've got about 10 minutes left here, so I think it's time to hand it off to Catherine for the Linkerd Heroes voting. So my slides are a bit out of order here. The Linkerd, again, you all are here because you're part of the Linkerd community. Please continue to encourage your friends and keep working with us in the community so that we can continue to grow. There has been a lot of folks who have been more active in Slack, who are helping each other out, which is really exciting for me to see. So we like to think we're building a nice, friendly community here. So yeah, please continue to take part, and thank you all for being here and for being a part of it. So yeah, with that, I think I lost that slide altogether, Catherine. Anyway, we have some news to share with you about the voting for Linkerd Heroes. So let's jump into that. Catherine, do you have?
I don't have anything. No,
okay.
There's no slide for that because we
You're just
were
gonna
letting
announce
the
it.
votes in until the last minute. But I think I kind of mentioned it in your Slack, so people may have seen that. I was like, oh no. So yeah, so Lutz won for his contributions to the CERT manager integration. But of course, one of the things that for us, like, everyone is a winner, because like we need people to contribute code, we need people to tell the stories, we need people to help in Slack. So basically, yeah, just Maxime, David, and Lutz, they're all three, they're our winners, of course. So yeah, thank you so much to them and for everyone who's also contributing. We couldn't really do this without you.
Lutz in particular has done a lot of work around the certificate infrastructure and finding really good issues on cert manager integration and Helm templating, and making a Linkerd much more configurable for providing different cert patterns and kind of production oriented usage. So it's really made the project better. Thanks, Lutz.
Thank you. Now I have to get down and get those other tickets or merge requests accepted as well. Yeah. Back to the grinding wheel then.
Yeah, well, we appreciate all the grinding that you're doing for us for sure. And so thanks for being part of the community and for your contributions. I've seen some of the more recent conversations that you've been having with Alex about the certificate bundles, which is, it's above my head. So I'm glad that there's somebody like you who's working on it, who can contribute to the community. So yeah, congratulations, Lutz. And again, thank you to David and Maxime as well for being part of the community. We've got a few minutes left, so we have time for Stump the Maintainer or Q&A. Did anybody, see, I don't see any questions in chat. Does anybody have any questions that they want to ask of Oliver or Alex or Thomas?
They're too helpful in Slack. People have asked for all their questions already, I'm sure.
Okay. Any other final comments then, Thomas or Oliver? Nope. Okay, well, I certainly appreciate you all for joining again today. Sorry for the technical difficulties at the beginning and for the spoiler alerts with my notifications. It's always good to see you all, and we hope to see you next month as well. Please keep an eye on the Meetup page as well as the Linkerd Twitter for updates about this Meetup and other talks that might be happening around Linkerd. And yeah, really appreciate you all. So thanks for being here and enjoy your holidays. And that's it. We'll talk to you next year.
Talk to you soon.